When we look at the evolutionary history of plants, a lot of what informs us are these fossils that we've been able to luckily stumble across. And one of the key answers to this mystery of the explosion of angiosperms has really been informed by this. In fact, some of our oldest fossils of flowers are getting pretty old, and there's evidence that they've existed for a lot longer than we might have thought. But these early flowers are very different than the flowers we see today, even in some of these kind of more basal groups of the angiosperm tree. We're going to see flowers that look very different than this guy, but these flowers are going to share a couple kind of quirks that these early flowers shared. And that's why a lot of times we think that the Ana grade and the Magnolia grade represent kind of the first step of flowering plants. So the Ana grade and the Magnolias are these kind of what we consider more basal angiosperm groups. The Ana grade refers to three big groups that their placement is a little unsure, but they include Amborella, the Nymphaeales, and a group called the Austrobaileyales. These three clades make up kind of the base of the angiosperm tree. They're somewhat related to the Magnolias, which a lot of us are very familiar with, but the Magnolias are going to represent more of a sister group to the kind of the major angiosperms, the monocots and what we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, the eudicots. But they represent a lot of interest to botanists because they kind of demonstrate probably some of these more basal traits or that first step to being a true flowering plant. Amborella and a lot of these other Ana grades are very lacking in diversity quite a bit, but they are of interest because of their unique placement. In fact, Amborella is a monotypic family. There's only one species in it, and that one species is found only on New Caledonia, and it's a very kind of primitive group because it has these kind of very interesting flower structures to it. And you can almost look at them and think of them like a cone that we are seeing in a lot of the gymnosperms that we've talked about to this point. The N in the Ana grade is the Nymphaeales. And really when we're talking about diversity in the Ana grade, this is what we're talking about. It's only 3 families within 8 genera and 80-ish species, but the cultural and kind of ecological importance of this group hits a little bit above their weight. Interestingly, they have these large, huge, magnificent flowers, and they're insect pollinated. Within this group, though, we see kind of all of them being aquatic. So this represents kind of a transition that plants came up onto land, and this group was probably one of the first groups to reinvade water and become aquatic again. And this represents a secondary invasion is what we call it, much like a lot of our aquatic insects are. The Nymphaeales are an interesting group because there's a lot of kind of interest in how exactly they're related to the other members of the Ana grade. And the morphological evidence from a lot of these plants, especially the Nymphaeales, kind of actually places them more toward the bottom of the angiosperm phylogeny, the more basal part of it. So these would actually be the more closely related members to gymnosperms. And so our topology or the shape of our tree can get really confusing depending on what we think the Nymphaeales is actually closely related to. And there's a lot of different evidence to put them different places, and so it needs a lot of new work. But what's going on is that we really think the water lilies are kind of a really good group to kind of start to model this Darwin's mystery of the explosion of angiosperms. Ecologically, though, the Nymphaeales are this really interesting group of aquatic plant that have a lot of really unique adaptations to living in these freshwater environments. Some of them have, like Victoria the water lily, have kind of iconic for they have these huge leaves that are able to spread out and take up surface area and float and compete for space. And living in kind of these muddy waters, a lot of these plants need to be able to get oxygen down to their roots. And they're able to bring them through very special modified structures, being able to move gases through their stems down deep into the water. They also have extremely long-lived seeds. In fact, some of our oldest seeds we've been able to germinate represent the sacred water lily from Egypt, where we've been able to germinate seeds found in tombs in the pyramids. And ethnobotanically, this group is a very interesting group. Water lily roots are consumed, especially in Asia, and are a common starchy food source. But they also have a lot of religious symbolism too, especially in Asian religions like Buddhism, where they represent kind of a rebirth from these muddy waters up into kind of the breathable blue atmosphere. The last A in the ANA group is a really kind of interesting clade, the Austrobaileyales. And like the umbrella, it's a very kind of small group that is really only demonstrated by one main species, Austrobaileyales scandens, and that only can be found in the Australian tropics. It's a weird kind of little understory woody vine, but the interesting thing about it is that it has specialized essential oil glands. So this is really one of the first groups that we see in angiosperms that really starts to get very interesting phytochemistry. Especially this phytochemistry is intriguing from an evolutionary aspect because the magnoliids are really good at having a lot of fun chemical compounds in them. So the next group up in our kind of dicot looks is the magnoliids, which represent kind of this big group right here after the ANA grade. These were the first angiosperms that we really saw to have a lot of those interesting compounds. And if you noticed in some of these, we have groups like the Nymphaeales and the Piperales here, of all ones that I'm sure in the past couple weeks, you've actually used probably a plant from one of those groups. We have things like black pepper come here, laurels, sassafras, and avocados belong in this group. The Piperales has historically, for human cultures, been one of the more interesting groups in the magnoliids. Really, they're a smaller order, and they don't have a lot of species in it, but again, we see the species that are in it really have a lot of interest for human consumption, especially black pepper. Black pepper comes from one plant, but has a lot of different varieties from it. And the drupes, that fruit that we get from them, are then ground up and put into food. In fact, a lot of the early trade routes that Europe had with Eastern Asia were essentially based on moving these species from the tropics in Southeast Asia and into Europe. The Nymphaeales is a big group of magnoliids, about 2,800 species or so, and they have a very unique morphology to them. They have these kind of clustered flowers, these kind of big fruits, and also very thick, leathery, evergreen leaves. But despite these kind of very unique morphology, they don't really have a lot of uniting traits in them. They're very kind of a collection of groups. And this kind of collection really captures a lot of plants that we use, especially cinnamon, sassafras, avocados, and bay laurels. The phytochemistry in these groups have really made these a dominant agriculture plant, especially when it comes to spices. Cinnamon is a really common spice that you can just go to your store and just get no problem. But it really the accessibility of getting cinnamon really kind of hides the complexity of farming of this tree species. And when you eat cinnamon, what you're essentially eating is the dried, ground up bark of the tree. A lot of Southeast Asian countries, this is a very important cash crop. And it's a very labor-intensive harvesting too, because you have to go into the woods, cut off these branches, and then dry them, and then get them to market. And high-quality cinnamon can be very intensive and very monetarily profitable for the people that are able to get high-quality cinnamon. But again, like any of these trades, there's a lot of kind of fairness and kind of sustainability issues that really get lost in the kind of large global markets. But of course, when we're talking about the magnolias really do take the center stage to these. And the magnolias represent a widely distributed group of temperate forest species. So this is really one of our most widespread of these basal angiosperm groups. But we do see a lot of tropical species in this order. What is really kind of fascinating is their flower format, because their flowers are very unique compared to a lot of the other flowers we'll be talking about for the little bit of the remaining of the semester. Because they're going to be spirally arranged, and their pistils and their stamens on them are kind of also clustered and spiraled along with these petals on them. In fact, the carpels, the male part, the female part of the system are really large and chunky, and they kind of support directly the stamens. And so we see this as kind of a more basal flower that the other angiosperms have modified and had natural selection work on them to be more specialized, where this is kind of more of a general, any pollinator can come up and pollinate it type plant. We also see a lot of large fruits in this. Pawpaw, which I know a few of you are particularly interested in, have these really large and really delicious fruit. And kind of interestingly, there's been a lot of interest in getting them more widely available in fruit markets. So the magnolia flower is a very large thing. And this large flower you might think of as being kind of a more derived feature. But having kind of a large flower makes you a good generalist. So if you don't have any specialized pollinators out there that are kind of going after you because you might have been one of the first flowers for insects to figure out, having this kind of open, large format really allows a lot of different pollinators to get on there, interact with your pollen, move pollen to another plant, and pollinate your plants. And so that's why most of the time we place the magnoliids kind of down toward the basal end of the angiosperm group. Magnoliids also have a lot of what we call Paleos disjunctions. So we believe at one time the magnoliids were widely spread across terrestrial Earth. But as the continents moved around, these populations became isolated and probably speciated. And so we describe this range as being paleo because it's so spotty, but probably likely represented just the breakup of one large population. As terrestrial Earth has changed, a lot of these ranges has contracted. And that's, again, allowed for a lot of speciation of these plants, because we have a really good fossil record of the magnoliids too. And when we look at the fossil record too, we see a lot of kind of essentially the same species that have just persisted for millions of years. And lastly, any talk about magnolias, we do have to talk about their ethnobotanical uses, because they've really captured kind of the cultural hearts of a lot of people, especially here in North America. Yellow poplar, the tulip tree, is a very common state tree for a lot of states out east, and an important forestry species in the southeast. The pickled flowers are kind of a delicacy in some areas of the southeast. When I lived in Mississippi, I was quite a fan of eating them. And then lastly, our state flags of Mississippi have really reflected their kind of love of magnolias. In fact, the original state flag of Mississippi was this really beautiful one with this nice grand Miss Magnolia right on it. And now their new flag, after intermittent period, they have a magnolia blossom on them. And it's really seen as a state emblem for Mississippi. So in summary, the basal angiosperms are diverse, especially in what they look like and what they do, but they might not contain a lot of species. The A and A grade is a very small group, but its relationships still need a long way for us to figure out exactly what was going on. And then with the magnoliids, we have the Nymphaeales, which include many important phytocompounds, especially things like cinnamon and avocados. And then lastly, the magnolias are these magnificent, huge flowers that are widely distributed and really probably represent the kind of pathway of angiosperms to global domination.